Record to the cloud. There we go. Okay, it's recording.
We hope.
We hope, yes. Michaela, you had a question.
Yeah, my question was if Jim knows or anybody knows any way to save the chat, because last week we lost it.
It'll save.
And where is it then saved?
On the cloud recording, Deanna can put it out.
Okay, got it. Okay,
you
cool.
also can click at the very bottom of the chat where it says more. It says save chat. It'll save it to your personal desktop. Anytime in the middle.
Oh, good.
And I have the Michaela. I have the chat from last time. So.
Cool. Mm-hmm.
And so you can create a generative conversation in the chat box. There's one other thing. I'm not going to try to do everything I was going to do. I have a Google Doc set up on the side where you could type into that. But let's just.
We just want to hear from you, Jim. We just want to hear you tell us.
It's all about the process. Okay, so I will go ahead and share screen and get on with it. Okay, you see my screen there?
Mm-hmm.
And now you see full screen.
While you're getting ready, I just want to welcome everybody because there was, I think, Nancy and Anthony and Gary joined in. We were talking to Brett earlier. Glenn Harrison's online, so welcome everybody.
Thanks, good to be here.
Thank you.
Take it away, Jim.
Okay. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to try to sort of set this up into 30 minutes of presentation, and then we can open up to discussion. Break it into 3 pieces here, but my dissertation was about a concept about relational coordination, a measure of how people in interprofessional groups work with each other. It turns out that, and especially in healthcare, people working across interprofessional groups, if they have shared goals, if they understand each other's job, if they have mutual respect, and if they communicate well, they measure high on this indicator. And when they measure high on an indicator, their outcomes are generally better. My interest was if you're doing an intervention to create greater relational coordination, how does that happen? So I was looking at the factors and processes underlying these increases. There's a couple of terms that I just want to throw out. Relational coordination is communicating and relating for the purpose of task coordination. There's a whole theory around relational coordination, and it's about you're always involved in an interdependent work process when you're talking about relational coordination. But those outcomes are mediated by organizational structures of various sorts. There's also a whole relational model of change, which talks in more depth about how those structures, organizational structures, mediate these outcomes. In the lens I brought to this research was positive organizational behaviors, which when I say that, I'm talking about high quality connections between people, energized, mutual, reciprocal, positive connections, and also positive emotions. And those are whole areas of positive organizational scholarship where those behaviors have been shown to produce good results in groups. I also looked at focus theory, which basically says that when people have a common focus of interest, they self-organize activities together, their interactions then create positive relationships between them. So I brought those lenses into the research. And the basic model of relational model of organizational change, which comes from Jody Hoffer-Gattel, puts relational coordination in the center. There's these 7 aspects of relational coordination and generates performance outcomes. But it's these interventions that people do as practitioners that do organizational change in groups that are using relational coordination. There's structural interventions that create the kinds of focal activities that connect people in activities. There's relational interventions, which create the ability for these kinds of interactions to be successful. And there's work process interventions that you can use that actually change the performance outcomes, or they're intended to. So 6 Sigma kinds of things where you're changing work process. These are often generated by the frontline leaders and coworkers, and the structural ones are by middle and top leadership. So basically, this is the model of relational coordination where interventions are mediated by relational coordination. Interventions have direct effect on outcomes, but they also affect how we relate, and those have direct effects on outcomes. So this is a mediation rule. My research is really saying, what are the factors and processes that actually mediate relational coordination? So lots of research has shown that this relationship occurs, almost nothing about this. So I want to know what's going on. The research question is really about what's going on. And I used a case study for that, an exploratory case study. I went into a single intensive care unit in a hospital where people had had success with relational coordination in the past and were engaged in a particular outcomes-based work at the moment. And I interviewed people in all different in different roles centered around nursing, but I interviewed doctors, physical therapists, dietitians, other folks, and nurses, and asked about their relationship, about what was going on when relational coordination was seen to increase in their environment. Out of that, I extracted through coding like 35 different factors and processes that they said were going on. I also, because it was a single case study, I zoomed out and I interviewed there were 15 people I interviewed in the ICU over a week that I stayed there. I also interviewed 8 consultants who had done relational coordination interventions in a variety of settings, some that worked, some that didn't work, and got their sense about what was important. So between the two, I ended up getting a sort of a composite picture of what might be going on. So the research approach is, here is my literature review. I had early conversations with people about what kinds of things might be going on. And I brought with it a whole lens about complexity theory and other sorts of things, positive organizational behaviors, that made me think about the space in this way. So then the real world was the experience that was out there, and also the experiences of the consultants that did this kind of work. I did their interviews. I looked at some of the quantitative data that had been used to measure RC in this environment, and the resulting analytic categories that I came up with came out of that work. These were the relationships that I looked at, and it was really like the relationship between the physicians or intensivists and nurses was high and stayed high. Between rehab therapists and nursing, it was low, and then it became very good The relationship between respiratory therapists and nursing was low and stayed low. And this relationship didn't exist before they started doing those interventions. So I got a wide variety of experiences. I ended up with these 35 descriptor codes, and I just structured them into the in order of occurrence so that I could get a feel for what was the most important, what were the most important of these things that came out of the coding. And I did that for both. The first one you saw was for the ICU participants, and the second one was for the consultants. And out of that, I got a sort of a cluster of activities that seemed to form out. I'm sorry, I've got my screen in the way here. The findings that I came up with sort of clustered into 5 areas. One was around a concept that I brought to the table that I wanted to explore, which is opportunity tension. When people feel an extreme opportunity to accomplish their purpose, they often become extremely motivated to do that. Champions result from that kind of work. People who just take the initiatives and run. So I was looking for opportunity tension, and it came up over and over. The relational factors, self-reinforcing factors of high quality connections, especially being heard, seen, and respected, combined with the norming behaviors in the group, were really strong. People took a lot of pride in saying, this is how we do it here. We acknowledge everybody on the floor. We expect that physicians will have not much greater power in a conversation between other caregivers in certain settings. When they did rounds in the morning, people, they changed the ownership of who ran the rounds in the morning for each patient. Sometimes nurses led them, sometimes the dietitians led them, sometimes the physicians, sometimes the nurses. And I've got a whole family going on here in this background. So that was that's the sense of how power was leveled in the environment was very strong. The relational sense making refers to the relational coordination framework provided a way of the collective, the interprofessional groups there to make sense of their environment. They used that as a language to talk about things that they would do, and it was always in terms of this sense-making framework that was brought into it. The activities that people focused on really were a way in which people built relationships and moved forward on common projects. What wasn't on my radar were contextual factors, how leadership played a role in supporting this. But those were the findings. The interpretation really turned into this model here, in which I can describe it very quickly here. Let me start this timer again. The folks in the ICU wanted to, or management wanted to implement what they called a liberation bundle. And that was a bunch of practices that reduced delirium in the ICU, which is a very big deal in terms of patient outcomes. So they decided they wanted to do that, and they knew they needed a relational package to implement it, because there was going to be a lot of changes, work process changes. And they knew from prior experience that work process changes were less successful unless they had a relational component to it. So management basically set the overall space. But the thing that they did was they were able to create a space, what I'm calling white space here, for people to get together and build the activities that they needed to implement this bundle. And so like backfilling, allowing people to come to these activities together and backfilling the positions. Excuse me for 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm in someone else's space. We're on the road traveling, and I'm not where I should be here. But so, bottom line, to explain this model that came out of it, basically, management strongly created a space in which activities could occur, and these activities were self-organized by the people there, and champions arose from those activities. In those activities, it was a very safe space. They leveled the power. Everybody had voice. And when people engaged in those activities, their relational capacity increased, their high quality, their interaction quality increased. The norms were established about how people interacted together, and that began to change everything. What it did is it created psychological safety so that people were always able to be in a learning mode, not threatened, or at least, most of the time, people were very oriented towards constant learning. So that combined with this idea of making sense together, seeing their relationships through these relational coordination surveys where they saw the strength of their relationships and they created activities to improve them, and also beginning to see themselves as a we instead of a me was huge. That sense making together, where people would have conversations of interdependence, they called them, where people would just ask each other, what can I do that's going to make your work easier? Here's what you can do to make mine easier. What is it that you do? So curiosity, humble inquiry, understanding each other's themselves within the world that they lived in, shifted the sense of me to we. And lots of amazing quotes from people about how that shift occurred and what it meant to them. And in all of these areas, people experienced sharp increases in opportunity, places where they saw the ability where they could go, I can do that. I can make this happen in my little piece of the world. And they took initiative to go ahead and make changes that culminated and cascaded into larger changes. So not only did some structures change the way people related to each other, where respiratory therapists and nurses changed the way they interacted, where they spent time with each other, and so forth, but also the way they communicated changed. So that's the model that came out of that. And it had some powerful implications, I think, in terms of practice. So I'm part of the Relational Coordination Research Collaborative. And one thing that I'm able to do as a result of this is have these conversations with people that practice in this space all the time, that aren't necessarily involved in research, but practice as consultants and so forth. And they are hungry to share their knowledge with each other and understand how to improve their practice to do these kinds of interventions. So some of the recommendations that come out of it based on these 5 areas that popped out in my study. were one around opportunity tension to actually really pay attention to it as an indicator of the seeds of organizational change, to really nurture it, and if it was possible, measure it. I don't know how you would do that, except qualitatively. But to really pay attention to the container and cultivate champions. And that's something that people can turn into their practice as intervention consultants. But also the people themselves that are involved, if in fact they were looking for those places where people were sparked, themselves and others, that putting energy around that, those seeds of spark is a way forward. Actively creating positive norms of behavior, and really thinking that communication is not just a functional thing that happens, but it's actually the means of building resource between each other, that through conversations you are building relationships, and to pay attention to the quality of those conversations, and especially pay attention to the levels of power that are constantly exerted between professions and amongst people with different status. The third area is sense making, relational coordination for a lot of situations when we're talking about relationships between interprofessional groups. It's a powerful framework, but it's not the only framework. Consultants bring frameworks of all sorts together, and it's more important that people make sense together. Seeing the system as a whole is a powerful transformative element. When you're thinking about collective work, the shift from me to we is really important. There's a lot of ways to do that. So pairing other kinds of frameworks like conversational frameworks, discourse frameworks. There's a variety of things that can be paired with the relational piece. Six Sigma, positive deviance, all sorts of things can be used. But it's important to create sense together. Focus and activity. If a change is around a single focus, if they had focused just around implementing the liberation bundle in the ICU, if they had focused just on changing work processes, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful as when there's multiple foci, when people are thinking about relationships, they're thinking about work processes around delirium, but also work processes about when people connect with each other, when they get updated, how they do rounds. One of the things that they did in a sort of a blankets way at this hospital was anytime you walked within 10 feet of another person, you were expected to make eye contact and welcome them into the space. And something as small as that, a little micro change, created ripple effects throughout the way you felt, the safety you felt, and the connections you had with people. And then last, the contextual factors, which were much more important than I had expected, really go to leadership in a great way. That the impact of power and privilege and the differences that operate, how it constrains and how it can enable are incredibly important. So paying attention from a leadership level about the space that's created by the way power is modeled and the physical ways that you create space for people to interact with each other is really important. And that first level of leadership can't do it alone. So in this case, what we saw was frontline leaders were given this space by their leadership to create the space for the people on the ground. And the middle level management was also given the space by executive management to create the space in a cascading sort of way. So an onion of leadership supporting leadership, giving space, giving safe space, was an important piece that came out of that. That's pretty much it.
Jim, what was your biggest surprise from your findings?
I think it was people's passion. You know, when I was on the unit, I did 15 interviews, and I basically had to follow people around because it was very difficult to get time. So people would make a commitment with me because they really wanted to talk about this. And we would schedule a time, and then we'd have to reschedule, and I just followed them around. So people wanted to talk. Mm-hmm. And when we did, I would say in those 15 interviews, I teared up probably at least 10 of them. Mm-hmm. The stories that people brought mm-hmm. were so focused, came so much from their passion mm-hmm. to want to do healthcare, to want to serve the people. So there was this overarching shared goal that was very diffuse of wanting to do the best for their patients. That was super powerful, but it wasn't specific enough for people to coordinate around. It was kind of a general contextual thing, just a social field that you could count on. But below that shared goal was purpose, shared purpose. So the respiratory therapist said, I want to get my people off the ventilator as quick as possible because I know in my domain that there are better outcomes for patients. And the physical therapist said, I know if I can get an ICU patient moving, the quicker the better, the better the outcomes. And so people brought their individual purposes together, and they were very passionate about those purposes. And that's where they started coordinating, figuring out how can I actually enable a physical therapist to help somebody walk when they're on the ventilator. Well, I can get them a portable ventilator and I can follow behind, but we need to be together at the same time. So I'm going to make an effort to do that. And so people took on their own purpose, and behind the purpose, they said, I know how to do that. So the passion that they brought from the individual agency that they had into the group, into the larger, serving the larger shared goal of patient health was probably the biggest surprise for me. It was a fired up crew of people. Yeah, I'm starting to feel it just saying it.
I could probably take the whole time talking about this because being an ex-ICU nurse, an old ICU nurse, so many things came up, so many experiences came up as you were talking, but it's just very powerful. But anybody else have questions?
Jim, this is Nancy.
Hey,
could
how
you
you doing?
describe a little? I'm good. It's good to really get a sense of where your research went. I love your model. I was wondering if you could describe your the white space a little bit more and how leaders were creating that. Mm-hmm. What did it really look like to enable that space, and what was happening within it?
So a couple different ways. I mean, the place I was at was very special in that they had executive leadership that really believed in this process of creating space for lower levels. But on the front line, some of the things were as simple as, okay, we're going to get together to start to discuss the results of looking at, they did a mapping of the relationship strength between all 7 of the different interprofessional groups. So they needed to look at that map together. And leadership said, we will give you 3 hours a week to do this work to the project people that were implementing the project. So to do that, they said, and those 3 hours a week, we'll backfill you. So you can be off your shift, not worry about your patients. We've got you covered. And they rotated. So they created scheduling things, structural things that allowed the people to have that space. They came into that space and they participated in the relational exercises alongside the frontline staff. So there was an example of modeling power leveling. Physicians have a huge amount of power. The intensivists are responsible for what happens on the ICU. The intensivists, the people self-organized in the group and said, we need to do rounds to every patient, but let's do those rounds so that someone else leads it. Someone in each group leads it each morning, someone else, so not the physician. So when they're in those rounds, which I participated in, one day the dietitian would lead rounds. The next morning, the therapist would lead rounds, and always the nurse who owned those patients were invited to give, the first view of what the patients were. And the physicians laid back and asked really humble inquiry sort of questions of people. What would you think if this was happening? So I don't know if that answers, but that's part of it.
Yeah, that's great. And how did they develop the capacity to really, do all of those dynamics within that setting? Or had they been working with consultants, or how did they get there?
So one of the pieces that came up as a code was something about, translated into fertile soil. The idea that people had been doing this kind of relational work for 10 years at this hospital. Not on this unit. They'd been doing stuff 5 years ago in this unit that was along those lines. But there was a certain amount of prior experience that created the space for doing that. When I talked to some consultants who went into other situations where the soil was not so fertile,
No worries.
let me see. I'm going to switch over. Somebody's going to come into this apartment and start banging on the walls. There are places where the soil was not fertile, and these kinds of things did not take off. And in fact, some of these people who had done amazing work in the ICU and in orthopedics went into elder care within the same hospital organization, and it was dead. They could not get it going. So they had to back off and take really small baby steps. So this idea of power leveling, leadership creating white space, paying attention to the soil, and knowing that, in fact, things that you did 10 years ago can contribute to a more fertile soil if you can create persistent structures of some sort that outlast the people that cycle through, was really important. Focusing on what you could do at the role level is part of the relational coordination model. It's about individual to individual, but it's really about thinking, how do doctors think of nurses? How do nurses think of housekeeping? How does housekeeping think of management? And what are the persistent structures you can create at the role level that will outlast the individuals? And there's a dynamic there, because when those champions and individuals leave, unless you've got really robust structures, things fall apart.
Yeah, well, that's what I would call really creating a culture in the organization. That then when new people come in, they're introduced to what's expected, right? How do we operate here? Yeah, so great.
Those were the phrases that people use. They said in the interviews, it says, this is how we do this here.
Right.
And the people that had been strongest champions for the longest and had success started thinking in the meta sense of saying, how are we going to keep this going when we leave? And started actively thinking about what structures would not only produce the results they wanted, but reproduce the structures to produce those results.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
What I was actually hoping to do, I created this sort of structure here today to move into breakouts and have conversations. The thing I wanted and hoped for in this group was to start from the fact that I was so aware of bringing my own mental models into this, and they were arbitrary, right? It's the stuff I was interested in. So that lens, I was so aware of how that lens affected what I coded for, what I asked, what I was hoping to find, what I found. So I wanted to think about this model that came out of it is really valuable. It starts to create some sense making for the people in my community, this relational coordination community, that's different from the relational coordination model. It's a much more granular level about why these interventions work. And it's new ground. It's like anybody could propose something in this space and that would bring some value because of the sense making that happens within my relational coordination research collaborative community. So what I wanted to hear was, what kinds of things am I missing? Just total blindness from my own model being what it is, personal. And what do you bring? The lenses you bring from your work that would help inform this model. So what I wanted to do was have you say, ask the question in small groups. What am I missing? What comments would you have? What would you have me pay attention to in this space as it evolves and develops?
So Jim, that brings up a question that I wanted to explore is this what you want to do going forward, is expand this model or validate this model? And how do you plan to use it in the future with your work?
Yeah, well, I do want to do that. Within this research collaborative, there's the Relational Coordination Research Collaborative that Jody Hoffer-Gattel has put together. There's probably 300, 400 practitioners in countries all over the world doing it in healthcare, in construction, in government. I went to Copenhagen for the Relational Coordination Roundtable, and we were hosted by the Danish government. In Copenhagen, the mayor of Copenhagen feeded, they had I don't know what they call it, but we had food and champagne in City Hall at Copenhagen because they use it in their municipal government. They use relational coordination in 63 hospitals there. And they're working it. People are working it. So this is a really rich space for me to try to harvest more of what people are doing. And it really brings up the question about, Jody's work was quantitative, like trying to get it on the map with these measures about relational coordination. Mine was the first really pure qualitative piece. So it's wide open to do work there. And then there's the practice piece where nobody's trying to do anything, but they're learning from it. And it stays, the practices stay local to their practice. I want to harvest those practices and bring them in a qualitative space and make that available to that community there. It's so rich. People know so much. So yes, I want to do that. That looks like fun. And I also, there's another thing that I want to do, which is a little meta, which is there's this research collaborative. And how does that research collaborative act as a community of practice? Just like this group of people here can act as a community of practice. How do you nurture a community of practice so that it produces and reproduces itself reliably? And so I'm interested in the social network mappings that allow us to see each other in more detail, to see ourselves as
Jim, you just froze. Does anybody have any comments while he's frozen in space there?
Actually, I do, but I don't know if he can hear me.
We can hear you. Yep, we can hear
I know,
you.
but I think, okay, I'll bring it up and hopefully he'll come back on. And if you don't mind, I wanted to just pose it to Jim as well. So when I think a real key here is the word passion, because we're talking about social systems, right? People. And when I heard Jim say that, you know, what maybe surprised him the most was the passion, it made me remember, because I think you all know I just finished my practicum, right? So I interviewed, you know, okay, IT professionals, and you would think like passion, IT professionals, but they work in the government. And I think if someone would ask me, you know, what was the most surprising, I would have said the same thing, because it was 5 people, and every one of them said, you know, they didn't say I have a passion, but you could tell they wanted to do the best job. They want to do the best job possible for the American public. And so, you know, the passion of being I don't know, I'm not going to say true patriot, but like, you know, a public servant. I was surprised, because years ago we had people that I call grow up in the government, and I could see, you know, them and myself being public servants. But a lot in this day and age, we have a lot of people that come from the corporate world, and, you know, don't have that history of being a public servant. So I was surprised that each of them said it in one way or the other, that it wasn't about the money, it wasn't about, you know, them. It was about being a public servant, although they didn't say those 2 words, but except one person. So I found that interesting, very interesting. And then when Jim said the same thing, being in a different field, right, the medical field, where he saw that, and then I'm talking about, you know, a very sound boring, dry IT type environment, and having that same theme come up, I found that interesting. And I think Jim could probably, he is already, but latch on to that as a foundation to really grow, because it's the passion that's pulling everybody together, it sounds like to me. Jim, are you here?
I
He's
am.
back.
Did you hear us?
I did.
Did that make sense?
It really does. It really does. I mean, I think that's one of the things that led me into this was this idea of opportunity tension that comes from the generative emergence model of Benjamin Lichtenstein. And part of it also, you know, going through the dissertation process at the same time and feeling where my energy was. This is the thing that really is interesting to me, is that not only does your lens affect the research, but your own personal experience. You know, you see your dissertation everywhere. It's kind of crazy, but I was like listening to what sense of opportunity I had, and brought that model and those questions from my own very personal experience to these other people's experience. You know, and it's a two-edged sword. It colors what you do, but it also informs what you do. So I was wondering if people would be willing to try this breakout business for just one round, where I asked the question of you, what is this model missing? What are the big pieces in your life that I just like completely off my map, that you know are important in change efforts that you've been involved in, especially when there are power differences, and especially when there are camps, people that have very different worldviews that must work together in an interdependent sort of way.
Jim, can you share your screen and put up the components of the model?
Yeah, and
can we just stay in one group and not go out into separate groups?
no, that's the whole point, is to have, we'll come back to it, but the point is to have everybody have a chance to have a conversation. Can you see that right now? Is that yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. The point would be for Marty to put us in breakouts of dyads, 2 people, and just talk for 5 minutes together, and then bring us all back to the group. So
Okay.
everybody,
Yeah.
everybody would have a chance to speak and be.
Well, our group is so small, I think we could still have a time to everybody have their moment to speak.
So, okay, so let me
We'll
make
just do
sure.
5 minutes in the dyads, and then we'll come back.
Okay,
So,
Thank you.
you and Marty take it away.
all right, I've got it set up so we'll go into dyads. Oh, wait a minute. No, hang on.
It'll be
I got to go.
5
There
groups.
won't all be dyads, okay? Because if I go up to where it's mostly dyads,
Yes.
someone's going to be by themselves, I think.
Right, and you can go in there, Marty, and put people in groups afterwards.
Well, I'm going to have it do automatically, okay?
Okay, no more than 5 minutes.
Easy.
And if you're in a group by yourself, just reflect on it, and we'll bring it all back.
I don't think it'll happen. So there'll probably be groups of 3. All right? Is
Okay,
everybody
that's
ready?
good.
We're gonna
5
do it.
minutes.
All
You've got to
right.
bring us back, though, Marty.
Oh, okay. I'll try.
Keep track of the time.
I'm
Okay.
looking. All right. Here we go. All right. Open all rooms.
So you can get that, join the breakout room, and you'll pop into a little room with a couple people. Make sure everybody has a chance to talk.
Huh. Doesn't have me on anything. How about I join?
No, I think we're still here. You're still muted.
Oh, we're still in
I'm
a,
sorry, should we click on leave meeting, or is that going to kick us
No.
out of the whole meeting?
No, I tried to join the main meeting, but it didn't seem to work. Join breakout room. You've been assigned to breakout room 1.
you know what, I apologize, but I have to actually go to another meeting.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Jim.
Hi. Hi.
There we are, we're back, right? Yeah.
We're coming back. I
Hey,
don't think
guys.
that Marty is bringing us back. We're just coming back on our own.
Whatever works.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to hear your voice, Lynn. I hope we'll reach out soon and schedule something.
Yeah, give me a call. Jim, I can't stay too much longer. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it stimulated lots of thoughts for me. And if I can just say a couple of things before I go, would that be all right?
Yeah,
Please.
sure.
Marty, have you got everybody back?
I don't know.
Did you break up the groups?
No, well, here, I can close all rooms. Here we go.
There you go. Thanks.
So,
But everybody, we were bad.
We're,
I didn't know each other's.
Lynn has to leave.
yeah.
so Lynn, what
Thanks,
did you want to
Lynn.
share before you left?
Yeah, if I can, just because I think our group had quite an interesting conversation. One of the things that came up for us, and it may be in your model, Jim, was just that for this to work, it's predicated to a certain extent on people's skill level around relationships. So the ability to work pinches, conflicts as they might arise, and so there's that piece plus the skill around leadership, because in your model you had good leadership, and often that isn't the case, and people trained in areas other than leadership. The other thing that we talked a bit about is that in your study, the common purpose was more evident. And so we were curious about how this might work in team situations where they actually are coming in at cross purposes or different ideas about what the main goal is and how you get clear or aligned about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess my final point is that it sounded like passion and purpose were really critical to this all working. And I just wondered, in my experience, sometimes very passionate people come in, well, with lots of energy and enthusiasm for something, but they actually aren't necessarily competent. So then what do you do with that?
Huh. Thank you.
And Christine and Barbara, you can maybe take it from here because I've got a dash, but did that kind of capture a bit of what we talked about?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks for having me. Awesome.
Sure.
Good work.
Okay.
Take
Talk to you
care.
soon.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay, good.
You know, it made me think about when Lynn had talked about abrasive leadership last time, just abrasive relationships in general, about how that taints and colors the whole project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Well, it creates a space and it becomes either fertile or not fertile.
It's the container.
Yeah, it's the container. Yeah.
So what else came out of those small conversations?
Well, I'll jump in. Anthony, is it okay if I do both of ours?
Hey, wait, Marty, did everybody come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
I closed the breakout rooms.
Okay.
I think a lot of people are dropping off.
Yeah, I
Right.
think they dropped off.
Yeah. So 2 things came up for us. One was the idea of competition and whether or not that exhibited itself, and if it did, what did it look like, and how did it, where was it coming from? And then the other was about vulnerability, which is what I'm looking at in some ways. I'm interested in knowing how transformative learning comes about. And in order for people to experience or engage in transformative learning, they've got to allow themselves to be vulnerable. And, having been on the patient end of this kind of stuff. It meant a lot to me to have an incredible amount of confidence in the team that was working on me. And so I wouldn't want to see vulnerability. But I also know that in order for people to really, to bring about real transformative change, that has to happen. It's the only way it's going to happen. And so, it's sort of, were there opportunities? Were people able to be vulnerable with each other? And how were they able to? How was that set up? I mean, what made it possible?
I'll just tack onto that with a similar experience. I had 2 different surgeries with very different experiences. I was just sharing that in terms of, Jim, I got your narrative and I got your model and I got the intellectual exercise of it. But in practice, I too don't want to see the staff vulnerable as I go into surgery. I think that has a time and place. But what I did see in the remarkable surgery that I had was the empathy and eye contact and the baton passing and the clarity with which they understood the process and where I was in the process and making me clear about the process, and that true sort of patient-centered experience that everyone talks about and very few people experience. And then I had the other experience of like feeling lucky, like I was lucky to be alive and walk out of the hospital because of how disjointed everyone was. And how that eye contact wasn't there, and those basic skills to work a pinch around giving me inappropriate medication, right? There was a pinch of between nurses in front of me, you know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff, like that's skills. So I would be very curious about how you could add a last chapter to this on, what are the 10 essentials? What's the training that's going to come out of this? Where's the practical application of how is this going to be grounded in reality? Where are the 2, you've got 2 case studies just in this group, a recent surgery, my surgery, like there's experiences here where, we're giving voice to the patient experience and the true bottom line that this impacts. I will never recommend that one surgeon, but I will always recommend that other one. There's that hospital I will never stay at again, but there's this other one. That's a bottom line, net promoter, customer satisfaction. It hits them where it hurts. And if the team is connected, good communication, active listening, empathy, all that stuff. What are the skills that are going to ground this?
I have a question to you, Marty, about why you thought vulnerability was essential to transformative learning. Well, let me ask that, and then I've got an answer about this business that you just brought up.
Yeah, so I have to tell you that I can tell my mental capacity is still not where it should be, but I'll do my best. Because in transformative learning is about completely, well, I wouldn't say completely, that's a little extreme. It's about really changing how you view the world, seeing things very differently. It's not about just incremental learning. It's the only way that really transformational change is going to come about, because you have to think differently in order to bring it out. And the only way you're going to get there is to allow yourself to challenge your assumptions and let other people challenge your assumptions and really let go of that. And that's a very vulnerable place. For people, that's part of their identity. So, we can use an extreme example, someone who is homophobic, and they're, especially for the religious right, it's, and then all of a sudden they begin to bump up against things that aren't fitting, it's those pieces, those experiences that don't fit in with your worldview. You can't make sense of it. It won't fit. So you can either choose to ignore it and push it away, and you'll go back to the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, that's fine. But if you're one of those people where it's just bugging you,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to really examine it. And it can. Let me just finish that. So one of the things that can happen with transformative learning, and transformative learning is generally described as being a very positive experience, it can completely change your life, and you may have to leave the groups you've been part of and join others. I mean, that's incredible vulnerability, to have to really rethink, who do I associate with now? Who do I connect with?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't happen all the time, but that is possible, and it's something. I mean, and Nancy and I have had this conversation about it's something to really think about as a practitioner, that there are some real difficulties, challenges with transformative learning.
So let me just jump on that. I thought that might be where you were going. One of the cycles that I saw there was a safe environment being created, so that there was psychological safety within a conversation. A person then being authentic.
Yeah.
And through that authenticity, maybe being somewhat vulnerable. The other person being empathetic and saying, okay, I'm gonna hold you here safely while you are vulnerable. And that other person then going, oh, this really is safe. So you got this spiraling safety that happens.
Yeah.
And other people seeing those interactions. So for example, in the ICU rounds in the morning, the physician says to the pharmacist, okay, so if you prescribe that med, what are the indications that we should be looking for in terms of breathing, and the pharmacist is stuck, just goes like, I don't know. And the physician doesn't trash him. The physician says, anybody else have an idea about that? The respiratory therapist says, well, isn't it da-da-da-da-da? And so by leveling the power, the physician creates an empathetic space where people then can see that it is okay to not know in this situation. Maybe not other situations, maybe not in front of the patient or whatever, but in this situation. And so the strength of the bond and the psychological safety and the trust gets built there. And then that serves them in the pinch points out in front of the patient, perhaps. But the whole idea of being called in instead of called out, instead of like, you don't know that? Calling them out, and person feels threatened and shuts down, as opposed to calling them in and saying, what else do you know about that might contribute? So you call them in, and I stay in the learning zone. I'm in the broaden and build space where it's not cortisol that's shutting me down. It's oxytocin that's creating my bonding. All that neurophysiology of being creative and open and innovative and bonded is activated instead of the opposite. So very much in line with what you said is what actually happened when things happen successfully on there, on the floor. So,
well, I would think, I just having seen my husband through medical school and residency and had my own experiences working in healthcare, that power leveling, if the medical field can do that, there'll be a long way to having better outcomes, because you can't have real dialogue if it's not amongst peers. That people have got, everybody's got their expertise, I'm really glad the surgeon had as much education as he did, but I'm forever grateful to the nurses who were just amazing to me. They were just, very caring. It's so, I had the similar experience that you did, Christine, where, on the excellent side is that, they were amazing. And in fact, in my pre-op visit, there was a situation where the surgeon was standing there with the chief resident, teaching facility, and he was having a teaching conversation in front of me and my husband, and it was really amazing just to sit there and listen and watch. He was saying, that the chief resident came in, looked at my x-rays and went, wow. And he said, yeah, that joint is shot. And he said, and he's had this conversation about, so do you do joint replacement or do you do the orthognathic, it's what it's called, the surgery? And it was really interesting because my surgeon was saying, I used to be, yes, replace that joint. And he said, no, I'm come full circle. And it was like, it's like they were putting their thinking on the table in front of us. It was amazing. And
they were being vulnerable with each other. And I think what came up for me, and to go back to what Christine said about, I don't want them to be vulnerable if they're caring for me. I think there's different kinds of vulnerability.
Yeah.
We want them to have high skills and they know what they're doing and they're following their processes and all of that. But to be able to think about, if something comes up, what should I do, and be vulnerable enough to have that conversation with somebody else. So
yeah, a teaching conversation is a different kind of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Anthony, I was wondering if you had thoughts in this space.
Yeah, welcome, Anthony. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. It's great to be here. So I'm the Director of Advancement and Outreach at Sabrick. I work out of the Oakland office. So working on a number of sort of alumni engagement initiatives, prospective student outreach. So it's great to be here and connect with all of you. My thought in my conversation with Marty was around the competition piece, and just sort of curious about that opportunity tension as the central component, and if those opportunities resulted in any sort of competition, and if that competition was generative or sort of bifurcating in the process for folks. Because I imagine it, with patient as central, that mission makes sense, but there are still sort of hierarchical pieces to contend with and career advancement.
Do you mean competition between people in the same profession, like between nurses or something?
Yeah.
I didn't ask those questions at all. It's in an ICU, I think there's less competition. There's less people. So a nurse has 2 patients, right, and there aren't like 5 nurses vying for. I could have asked questions about competition in terms of their competency. I didn't ask those questions. I'm not sure how it played, but somehow it didn't seem that it was important. I think everybody felt they had a role, a unique role. Mm-hmm. And a key element was that if people felt they were heard, seen, and respected, is the phrase I'm using, mm-hmm. That made a huge difference. It created a lot of safety. It felt a lot of security, a lot of self, it's a way to, you're stroked. Mm-hmm. And that was a door opener, that just for a physician to power level by dropping back and listening was huge, in terms of, I, as a dietitian, have something to say and people are interested, Mm-hmm. Housekeeping was not in that conversation, but they should have been, because they're the ones who make the space available for people to opt to work in. Mm-hmm. And management, administrative management was not, of course, in those rounds. But there could be other activities that bring those people in, and they would be important for a fuller system picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
We should probably wrap up. My battery is dying. I'm really technically challenged on this call. I appreciate how flexible everybody was here.
Jim and I was in a dyad together. We thought that was kind of funny. And, but what we also acknowledged was we're in a collaborative learning space, and that even includes using technology. So, okay. Anyway, thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
This was really great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anthony, I appreciate you coming.
Okay. Bye, y'all. Have a great day.
All right.
Bye, everybody.